They say you should never look a gift horse in the mouth, but what if that gift is a crumbling farmhouse that hides a 30-year-old secret? For Sophie and Joshua, two siblings who grew up with nothing, this inheritance was supposed to be their fresh start. Instead, they found a house that felt like it was watching them, and strange noises coming from beneath the floorboards. This is a story about the choices we make when we're backed into a corner, and how a terrifying discovery in the dark can sometimes lead to the brightest redemption. Before we step onto the porch, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps us keep bringing you these powerful stories. Now, grab a warm blanket and settle in, because this is a story you won't want to miss. The radiator of the rusted sedan hissed, a low, sibilant sound like a dying snake that seemed painfully loud in the crushing silence of the West Virginia mountains. Sophie Evans tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles bleaching white against the cracked, sun-faded leather. The vibration of the engine traveled up her arms, settling as a dull ache in her shoulders, a physical reminder of the 600 miles they had put behind them since leaving the city. Beside her, Joshua was asleep, his forehead pressing rhythmically against the cool glass of the passenger window. At 19, he still looked like the little boy she had tried to shield from the world. The messy hair, the slightly parted lips, but the hardness around his jaw and the permanent tension in his shoulders, even in sleep, told a different story. He was a coil of wire wound too tight, waiting to snap. Sophie took a breath, holding it in her lungs until they burned, trying to steady her racing heart. They were drifting. That was the only word for it. Since the state had finally washed its hands of her at 21, and Joshua had aged out of the system 2 months ago, they had been untethered in a way that felt less like freedom and more like freefall. No more caseworkers with their clipboard smiles. No more temporary beds in houses that smelled of other people's laundry detergent. No more rules, but also no safety net. Just this car, 3 duffel bags of clothes that smelled of laundromats, and a registered letter that felt heavy in her pocket, like a stone she was carrying to the bottom of a river. She looked out at the road ahead. It was a ribbon of gravel winding up into a canopy of dense, ancient oaks that blocked out the late afternoon sun. The GPS on her phone had lost signal miles back, the blue dots spinning in a void of gray grid lines, leaving them to navigate by the fading daylight and the handwritten directions the court-appointed lawyer had given them. Evans, Ridge, she whispered, testing the weight of the name on her tongue. It tasted like dust and impossibility. Joshua shifted, groaning as he woke. He rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands, blinking groggily at the tunnel of trees. "Are we lost?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "No," Sophie lied, though her heart was hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm against her ribs. "We're close. The mailbox should be up here on the left. Look for a rusted tractor tire." "I still say we sell it," Joshua muttered, sitting up and pulling his hood over his head, a defensive gesture she knew too well. It was his armor. "We get in, we sign the papers, we find a buyer. We take the cash and go to California. Start fresh. No memories, no winter." Sophie didn't answer immediately. She kept her eyes on the gravel, navigating a pothole that threatened to swallow their front tire. She couldn't tell him that the idea of fresh terrified her. She didn't want fresh. She wanted solid. She wanted something that couldn't be packed into a trash bag in 10 minutes. The letter from the lawyer had been a shock. A grandfather named Jacob Evans, a man their father had never spoken of. A man who had died 6 months ago and left them everything. It sounded like a fairy tale, and Sophie had learned the hard way that fairy tales were usually just pretty lies wrapped in disappointment, waiting to rot. The car crested a steep hill, the engine whining in protest, and the trees suddenly broke. Sophie hit the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the loose stones. Below them, nestled in a valley that looked as if it had been scooped out of the earth by a giant's hand, lay the farm. It was breathtaking and heartbreaking all at once. The house was a Victorian sprawling beast, its white paint peeling like dead skin to reveal gray, weathered wood beneath. A wraparound porch sagged dangerously on the left side, and the roof shingles were patchy with moss, looking like an erratic quilt. But the bones of it were majestic, high gables, tall windows, and a defiance against the encroaching forest. A massive barn stood to the east, weathered to a deep tobacco brown, looking anchored to the earth. "Whoa!" Joshua breathed, the cynicism momentarily knocked out of him. "It's ours," Sophie said, the words feeling foreign, illegal almost. "It's actually ours." They drove down the winding driveway, the gravel popping under their tires like firecrackers. When Sophie killed the engine, the silence of the country rushed in to meet them. It wasn't the empty silence of a city apartment. It was heavy, filled with the drone of cicadas, the rustle of wind in the high, uncut grass, and the distant, harsh call of a crow. They stepped out. The air smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and something sweeter, rotting apples from the neglected orchard. It was a sharp contrast to the exhaust and stale grease of the city they had left behind. Sophie walked up the porch steps, testing each board before putting her weight on it. She retrieved the key from the lockbox the lawyer had described. It was heavy, brass, and cold in her palm. Inside, the house was a time capsule. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light, cutting through the heavy velvet drapes, swirling like microscopic galaxies. Sophie ran a hand over a hallway table. Her fingers came away gray with grime, but beneath the dust the wood was smooth as glass. It was walnut, the grain swirling in complex, hypnotic patterns. Every piece of furniture in the entryway, a coat rack that looked like a stylized tree, a bench with clawed feet, a mirror frame carved with ivy, was handcrafted with an obsessive level of detail. "Grandpa Jacob was a carpenter," Sophie murmured, remembering the lawyer's brief description. "A master, apparently." "He was a ghost," Joshua said, his voice echoing too loudly in the high-ceilinged hall. He kicked a pile of junk mail that had accumulated on the floor. "Dad never said a word about him, not once. Why leave us this? Guilt? Paying off his conscience?" "Maybe," Sophie said, stepping into the living room. The furniture was draped in white sheets, looking like silent phantoms waiting for a seance. Or maybe he just didn't have anyone else. The first few nights were an exercise in psychological endurance. The house groaned. The wind whistled through gaps in the window frames, sounding like low, mournful flutes playing a funeral dirge. The darkness out here was absolute, a heavy, velvet curtain that pressed against the glass, impenetrable and isolating. Joshua, whose survival instincts had been honed in group homes where sleep was a vulnerability, refused to settle. He slept on the sofa in the living room, with a baseball bat within arm's reach, his eyes dark circles of exhaustion. He checked the window locks 3 times a night, a ritual of anxiety that broke Sophie's heart. "I heard it again, Sophie," he said on the 3rd morning, stabbing at a bowl of instant oatmeal that had gone cold. "Heard what?" Sophie asked. She was washing their few dishes in the deep porcelain sink, the water freezing because the water heater was on the fritz. The soap wasn't lathering, and her hands ached from the cold. Coughing. Or dragging. Something. It was under the floor, right under the kitchen. "It's an old house, Josh. Pipes settle, wood expands and contracts with the temperature. It was 50 degrees last night." "It wasn't pipes," he insisted, his jaw tight, his eyes darting to the floorboards. "And the bread is gone." Sophie paused, the sponge hovering over a plate. "We ate the bread." "We had half a loaf. It's gone." And the jar of peanut butter moved from the counter to the pantry. "I know where I put it." Sophie turned off the tap. She dried her hands on a rag, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. She had noticed the peanut butter too. She had assumed Joshua had moved it and forgotten, or eaten it in a sleep-deprived binge. "Maybe we have rats. Big ones. I'll look for traps in the barn later. I'm telling you, it feels like we're being watched," Joshua said, standing up and pacing the kitchen, his boots heavy on the linoleum. "I don't like it here. It feels occupied, heavy." The tension broke 2 nights later. A thunderstorm had rolled in over the ridge, violent and loud, shaking the old house to its foundations. Thunder cracked like a whip directly overhead, the sound tearing the sky apart, and the farmhouse plunged into darkness as the power lines went down. Sophie was in the upstairs hallway, using her phone as a flashlight. The beam cut a narrow cone through the dusty dark. "Joshua?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Down here!" His voice came from the kitchen, sharp, urgent, and laced with panic. Sophie hurried down the stairs, the beam of her light bouncing off the walls, illuminating flashes of peeling wallpaper and family portraits of people she didn't know. She found Joshua standing in the pantry, the baseball bat raised over his head, his chest heaving. The lightning flashed through the window, illuminating his face. He looked terrified and ferocious. "What is it?" Sophie hissed, grabbing his arm. "The rug," he whispered, pointing with the bat. "I kicked it by accident in the dark. Look." Sophie shone her light on the floor. The heavy wool runner had been kicked aside, revealing a seam in the floorboards that shouldn't have been there. A recessed iron ring lay flush with the wood. A trap door. "Joshua, don't," Sophie warned, sensing his intent. "We don't know what's down there. If there's someone in here, I'm not waiting for them to come out while we're sleeping," he growled. "I'm not doing that again, Sophie. Never again." She knew what he meant. The foster home in Ohio. The one where the door didn't lock. He hooked his fingers through the ring and pulled. The door groaned, the hinges screaming in rusted protest. A draft of stale, warm air rushed up, smelling of tomato soup, sawdust, and old paper. Below, a dim light flickered, not electric, but the soft, dancing glow of a kerosene lamp. Joshua didn't hesitate. He descended the narrow wooden stairs, the bat ready to strike. Sophie followed, her heart hammering against her throat, terrified he would hurt someone or get hurt himself. "Get out!" Joshua yelled as he reached the bottom. "Whoever you are, get out!" Sophie reached the landing and swung her phone light around. It wasn't a crawl space. It was a fully finished basement apartment, hidden away from the world. There were oriental rugs on the concrete floor, bookshelves lining the walls packed with paperbacks, and a small kitchenette with a camping stove. And in the corner, huddled together on a velvet loveseat, were two elderly people. The man was thin, his skin like parchment paper stretched over fragile bone, his hands trembling as he held them up in surrender. The woman was shielding him, her body angled between Joshua and the man, her face a mask of defiance and terror. They looked frail, ancient, and utterly harmless. "Please," the woman said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Please don't call the police. We'll go. Just let us get our coats." Joshua lowered the bat slowly, confusion washing over his face. The adrenaline was still pumping, making his hands shake. "Who are you?" "I'm Arthur," the man rasped. He coughed. A wet, rattling sound that explained the noises Joshua had heard for days. "This is my wife, Eleanor. We live here. You were squatting." Joshua accused, his voice regaining some of its edge, though he sounded unsure now. "Stealing our food." "Borrowing," Eleanor corrected gently, standing up to adjust the blanket around Arthur's shoulders. "We ran out of canned goods 3 days ago. We didn't know Jacob had died until the house went quiet for so long. We were too afraid to come up." Sophie stepped forward, lowering her phone, illuminating their faces. They looked exhausted, worn down by years of hiding. "Why were you hiding? Why didn't you just leave when he died?" Arthur looked at Sophie, his eyes watery and blue, clouded with cataracts. "We have nowhere to go, miss. And the arrangement. Jacob made us promise. No one was to know we were here. He said if they found out, they'd take the house away from him. We've been down here for 3 years. Sophie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. 3 years? In the dark? He let us up at night, Arthur said softly, to work in the shop. That was the deal. I helped him with the commissions, and he gave us a place to be safe. We lost our house, you see. My health. I couldn't work like I used to, not with my leg. And then when the cancer hit, the medical bills took everything. We had no savings, no safety net. Joshua looked at Sophie, his expression hardening. Sophie, We can't do this. We can barely feed ourselves. We can't run a nursing home for two strangers who've been leeching off the property. We have to sell. We aren't leeches, Eleanor said sharply, her pride flaring like a match in the dark. We worked for every slice of bread we ate. My husband is a master craftsman. We have to call the sheriff, Joshua said to Sophie, ignoring Eleanor. We have to get them out. If we want to sell the place, you can't sell it. A deep, booming voice came from upstairs. Sophie and Joshua spun around. They hadn't heard the front door open over the sound of the thunder. Heavy footsteps creaked on the floorboards above, and then a man appeared at the top of the trapdoor stairs. He was illuminated by a high-powered tactical flashlight, holding a dripping, wet umbrella. He descended the stairs with an air of absolute ownership. He was in his 50s, wearing a pristine raincoat that shed water like oil, and expensive leather boots that had no business in a basement. He had a square jaw, silver hair, and eyes that calculated the value of everything they touched. "Who are you?" Sophie demanded, stepping in front of Joshua, her protective instinct flaring. "James Colton," the man said smoothly. "I own the land abutting this property to the north and west. I saw the lights go out and saw your car. Thought I'd check on the new neighbors." His eyes swept over the basement, lingering on Arthur and Eleanor with a look of mock surprise. "Well, well, Arthur Mills, I wondered where you disappeared to. There's still a warrant out for you in the county, isn't there? Something about a series of bad checks passed at the lumber yard." Arthur shrank back against the cushions, wheezing. "Get out of our house," Joshua said, stepping forward, the bat still in his hand but lowered. Colton chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Technically, son, it's barely your house. Jacob Evans died, owing a significant amount in property taxes. About $15,000 by my last estimate. And since I sit on the zoning board, I happen to know the county is preparing to foreclose if that debt isn't settled within 30 days. He looked at Sophie, his smile tight and predatory. "I've been trying to buy this land for years." Jacob was stubborn. "I'm hoping you two are smarter. Sell me the deed. I'll pay the back taxes, give you a little walking around money, say 10 grand, and I won't mention to the sheriff that you're harboring a fugitive down here." Sophie looked from Colton's smug face to Arthur's terrified one. She looked at Joshua, who looked ready to punch Colton or run away. She couldn't tell which. She felt the walls closing in. They had inherited a sanctuary, only to find it was a trap. The rain hammered against the roof all night, a relentless assault that matched the turmoil inside the house. By morning, the sky was a bruised purple, clearing slowly. The kitchen was silent. Sophie sat at the long wooden table, a mug of black coffee in her hands, watching the steam curl into the cold air. Joshua was pacing again, his energy frantic. "He's right, Sophie," Joshua said, his voice low and desperate. "We sell, we take whatever he gives us, and we go. We don't owe these old people anything. They are strangers." Sophie looked at the trap door which they had left open. "If we kick them out, Colton calls the police. Arthur goes to jail. Look at him, Josh. He's sick. Jail would kill him. Do you want that on your conscience?" "That's not our problem," Joshua snapped, though there was a crack in his voice. "We have our own problems. We don't have $15,000. We don't even have $1,500. Just then, Eleanor came up the stairs. She moved slowly, her joints stiff from the damp basement air. She didn't look at them. She went straight to the stove, struck a match to light the pilot with a practiced flick of her wrist, and began pulling cast-iron skillets from the racks. "What are you doing?" Joshua asked, baffled. "Making breakfast," Eleanor said matter-of-factly. "You can't think on an empty stomach, and that boy looks like he hasn't had a hot meal in a month. You're all elbows and knees." She worked with a rhythm that spoke of decades of practice. She found a bag of flour, a tin of lard, and a jar of preserved sausage she must have canned herself years ago. Within 20 minutes, the smell of biscuits and sausage gravy filled the kitchen, a rich, peppery, comforting scent that made Sophie's mouth water violently. It smelled like a home she had imagined but never known. Eleanor set 2 plates down in front of them. "Eat!" Sophie took a bite. It was warm, savory, and tasted like safety. She looked at Eleanor, seeing the lines of worry etched into her face, the same lines she saw in the mirror every morning. The look of someone holding on by their fingernails. "You can stay," Sophie said quietly. "Sophie!" Joshua slammed his fork down. "They stay," Sophie repeated, her voice firming up. "Colton wants this land. He wants it bad. That means it's worth more than he's offering. We aren't selling. We're going to pay the taxes." "How?" Joshua laughed bitterly. "I have $40. You have less. We can't grow 15 grand in the garden." Arthur appeared at the top of the stairs. He was leaning on a cane, breathing hard from the climb. He looked at Joshua with a strange intensity. "The barn?" He wheezed. Joshua looked at him. "What about it?" "Jacob wasn't just hoarding junk," Arthur said. "Come with me, son." Joshua hesitated, then looked at Sophie. She nodded. He got up, grabbing his jacket, and followed the old man out the back door. Sophie watched them go through the window, then turned to Eleanor. "If we do this, if we fight him, we need to know everything. No more secrets. Why was Jacob so afraid?" Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes glistening. "Jacob was a man running from himself, honey. He thought he could buy redemption with isolation, but we'll talk about that later. Right now, we need to save this farm." Out in the barn, the air was cold and still, smelling of sawdust and oil. Arthur flipped a breaker switch, and the hum of electricity buzzed overhead as rows of shop lights flickered on. Joshua gasped. The barn wasn't filled with hay. It was a cathedral of woodworking. Massive saws, planers, jointers, and lathes stood in organized rows covered in tarps. But it was the wood that caught Joshua's eye. Stacks and stacks of it, reaching from floor to ceiling along the back wall. Rough-cut lumber that looked dark and ugly on the outside. Arthur walked over to a stack, picked up a cabinet scraper, and ran it along the edge of a board. He blew the dust away. The wood beneath was a deep, fiery red, glowing in the artificial light. "Cherry," Arthur said reverently. "And over there, black walnut. Cured for 20 years. There's $50,000 of lumber in this room, easy, if you know what to do with it." Joshua ran his hand over a lathe, the cold steel biting into his palm. He had always been good with his hands. In the group homes, he fixed toasters, bikes, anything he could take apart. He understood how things fit together, even if he couldn't make himself fit into the world. "Jacob had orders," Arthur said, pulling a dusty ledger from a shelf. "High-end furniture, custom pieces for rich folks in D.C. and Richmond. He took deposits, but he never finished them because he got sick. If we finish them, we get the balance. It could be enough." "I don't know how to build furniture," Joshua said, pulling his hand back. "I fix cars. I break things. I don't create." "I do," Arthur said. He looked at Joshua, seeing the potential in the boy's slender, strong hands. "I was a master carpenter for 40 years before my leg went bad, and then the arthritis took my hands. I can't hold the tools steady anymore. My hands shake too much. But you have the strength. I can teach you. I can be your hands, if you'll be my strength." Joshua looked at the old man. For the first time in his life, an adult wasn't looking at him as a problem to be managed, but as a solution. "Show me," Joshua said. The next 3 weeks were a blur of sawdust, sweat, and transformation. The house changed from a place of fear into a hive of industry. They moved Arthur and Eleanor into the guest rooms upstairs. The change in the couple was miraculous. With sunlight and proper food, Arthur's color returned, and Eleanor's sharp wit began to shine. Sophie took over the logistics. She found Jacob's ledger and began calling the clients, charming them, apologizing for the delays, promising delivery. She managed the money, counting every penny, buying only the essentials: rice, beans, glue, sandpaper. She worked in the garden with Eleanor, learning to tell weeds from food, learning that patience was a weapon. She learned to preserve tomatoes, her hands stained red, listening to Eleanor's stories of the valley before the developers came. But the real transformation was in the barn. Joshua was a natural. He absorbed Arthur's instructions with a hunger that surprised them all. Arthur taught him to listen to the wood, to feel the grain direction so the planter wouldn't tear it out. "Don't force it, Joshua," Arthur would say softly when Joshua got frustrated and tried to jam a mortise and tenon joint together. "The wood wants to fit. You just have to clear the path. Patience. You can't bully the wood." One afternoon, Sophie brought them lunch. Sandwiches on Eleanor's homemade bread. She stopped in the doorway, unseen. Joshua was at the lathe, turning a table leg. He was focused, his safety goggles reflecting the spinning wood, his face calm. The perpetual scowl was gone. Arthur stood behind him, guiding his shoulder gently. "That's it," Arthur whispered. "Feel the chisel cutting? Let the tool do the work. Smooth as silk. You've got the touch, son. You've got the gift." Joshua smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. Sophie felt a lump in her throat. They were healing. They were building something real. But James Colton had not given up. He was watching. It started with small things. A county inspector showed up, claiming they had an illegal septic setup. Then, the power company cut their line, quote, "by mistake," leaving them in the dark for 2 days until Sophie threatened to sue, using legal jargon she Googled on her dying phone battery. Then, the water changed. Sophie was filling a pitcher from the tap when the smell hit her, pungent, oily chemical. She tasted a drop and spat it out immediately, gagging into the sink. Diesel. She ran to the window. Up on the ridge, on Colton's property line, she saw a yellow excavator parked near the creek that fed their well. "He poisoned the well," Sophie whispered, horror turning to a cold, hard rage. She ran to the barn. "Josh! Arthur!" When they saw the water, Joshua's face darkened. He grabbed a heavy iron crowbar from the bench. "I'm going to kill him. I'm going to go up there and smash his face in." "No!" Arthur caught his arm. His grip was surprisingly strong for a dying man. "That's what he wants. He wants you to do something violent so he can call the sheriff and lock you up. Then he takes the farm by default." "We can't drink this!" Joshua shouted, slamming the crowbar down so hard it chipped the concrete floor. "We can't wash in it! He's winning!" "We use the rain barrels for washing," Eleanor said, coming in behind them, her face grim but composed. "We boil water from the spring up the mountain for drinking. We haul it. We don't break. We do not let him see us break." The physical labor of hauling water added to their exhaustion. Every morning before the sun rose, Joshua and Sophie hiked a mile up the ridge with 5-gallon buckets, filling them at the natural spring and lugging them back down. Their muscles screamed, their hands blistered, but it hardened their resolve. They finished the first major commission, a dining set for a lawyer in Charleston. When Sophie deposited the check for $6,000, they celebrated with a store-bought cake. They were almost halfway there. But Colton knew they were making progress. 2 days before the tax deadline, he intercepted Joshua in town at the hardware store. Joshua was loading a box of sandpaper into the truck when Colton leaned against the door, flanked by 2 burly men in construction vests. "Impressive work, kid," Colton said, chewing on a toothpick. "I hear you're actually filling orders. Didn't think a foster kid had the discipline. Thought you'd have pawned the tools by now." "Get out of my way," Joshua said, his heart racing. "I just wanted to let you know." Colton lowered his voice, leaning in, smelling of expensive cologne and malice. "I found the paperwork on your friend Arthur. It's not just a small bad check. It was a series of them, totaling over $1,000. In this state, that's felony fraud. If I make a phone call, the state police will be at your farm in 20 minutes. He'll die in prison, and you'll be charged with harboring a fugitive." Joshua froze. The blood drained from his face. "Here's the new deal," Colton said, dropping a business card on the seat. "You sign the deed over to me by noon tomorrow. I pay the taxes, I give you 10 grand cash. You and your sister drive away. I forget I ever saw Arthur Mills. Or you stay, and I burn your little world to the ground, starting with the old man." Joshua drove home in a daze. When he got back, he didn't go to the house. He went to the barn. He started packing his tools. His mind was spiraling. He had to save Arthur. The only way to save Arthur was to give Colton what he wanted. Or maybe if he just burned the barn down. The insurance money would pay the taxes and they could run. It was a panicked, irrational thought, born of old trauma, the instinct to destroy before he could be destroyed. Sophie found him pouring a can of kerosene onto a pile of wood scraps, tears streaming down his face, his breathing ragged. "Joshua! What are you doing?" she screamed, grabbing the can and wrestling it away from him. "He knows, Sophie. He's going to call the cops on Arthur. We have to leave. We have to run." Joshua was shaking, hyperventilating. "I can't let them take Arthur. He's the only one who ever taught me anything. He's the only father I've ever had." Sophie grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her. "We aren't running. Do you hear me? We aren't the kids in the system anymore. We are Evanses. This is our land. He'll put Arthur in jail." "Let him try," Sophie said, her eyes blazing with a ferocity Joshua had never seen. "We'll fight him in court. We'll tell everyone what he did to the water. But we do not burn down our future. We stand our ground." She pulled him into a hug, holding him tight as he sobbed into her shoulder. The smell of kerosene and sawdust surrounded them. "We stay," she whispered, "and we fight." The morning of the deadline, the sky turned a sickly, bruised green. The forecast called for a storm, but what arrived was a deluge. A, quote, 100-year event, the radio warned. The rain didn't fall. It was driven sideways by howling winds. The creek, already swollen from Colton's illegal damming and excavation upstream, began to rise rapidly. It turned from a babbling brook into a roaring brown monster. "The barn!" Arthur yelled over the wind as he looked out the kitchen window. "The water is rising! The furniture!" They had 3 finished pieces, a massive walnut desk, a cherry credenza, and an intricate rocking chair, waiting for delivery. They were worth $10,000. Enough to pay the taxes. If the water reached the barn floor, the wood would warp, stain, and ruin. Their future would rot. "We have to move them to the hayloft!" Joshua shouted, pulling on his boots. They ran into the storm. The wind lashed at them, stinging their faces. The water was already ankle-deep in the yard, brown and churning with debris. Inside the barn, it was seeping under the doors. "Sophie, grab the drawers! Eleanor, get the clamps!" Joshua took charge, his voice booming with authority. "Arthur, help me with the rigging! We need the block and tackle!" They used the pulley system attached to the rafters. Joshua scrambled up the ladder to the loft, hauling on the rusty chains. Arthur, ignoring his arthritis, guided the heavy walnut desk from below, his face pale with exertion. Sophie and Eleanor shoved wedges under the other pieces to keep them off the damp concrete. They worked like a machine, wet to the bone, muscles screaming, as Joshua hauled the last piece, the rocking chair, up to safety. A roar louder than the thunder tore through the valley. Sophie looked out the barn door. The bridge, the small wooden bridge that connected their driveway to the main road, was buckling under the pressure of the flash flood. And on the bridge was a black truck. James Colton's truck. The vehicle was halfway across, its wheels spinning on the slick, shuddering wood. Colton must have been trying to cross to check on his expensive excavation equipment on the far ridge, blinded by greed and panic about his own investment, ignoring the danger of the rising water. As they watched, the bridge supports snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The truck pitched forward, nose-diving into the raging brown water. It didn't sink immediately. It caught on a submerged log, the current battering it, threatening to flip it over and sweep it downstream. Inside, they could see Colton slamming his hands against the glass, his face contorted in a silent scream. "Let him drown," Joshua said, his voice cold. He stood in the barn doorway, dripping wet, his chest heaving. "He poisoned us. He tried to ruin us. He deserves it." Arthur stepped up beside him. The old man was shaking, not just from cold, but from adrenaline. He looked at the truck, then at Joshua. He placed a hand on Joshua's arm. "We don't let people die, son," Arthur said softly. "That's not who we are. That's who he is. If you let him die, you become him. Joshua looked at Arthur, the man Colton had threatened to imprison. He saw the grace in the old man's face, the absolute moral clarity. "Damn it," Joshua yelled. He grabbed a coil of heavy rope. "Sophie, tie this off to the tractor! Arthur, feed me the line!" Joshua plunged into the floodwaters. The cold was a physical blow, punching the air from his lungs. The current tried to sweep him off his feet, dragging at his legs like concrete hands. But he fought it. Leaning into the flow, he reached the truck, just as the water began to rise over the hood. He smashed the driver's side window with his elbow, ignoring the sharp pain of shattering glass. "Give me your hand," he screamed at Colton. Colton was paralyzed with fear. Joshua reached in, grabbed the man by his expensive lapels, and hauled him out. "Pull!" Joshua yelled to the shore. Sophie and Eleanor reversed the tractor, the rope going taut. Joshua held onto Colton with one arm and the rope with the other, fighting the river until his feet found mud. They collapsed onto the sodden grass of the bank, gasping for air, the rain washing the mud from their faces. Colton lay in the mud, coughing up water. He looked up at Joshua, then at Arthur, who was standing over him with a wool blanket. The arrogance was washed away, leaving just a shivering small man. "Why?" Colton wheezed. "Why help me?" "Because we're neighbors," Arthur said, dropping the blanket on him, "and because my grandson is a better man than you will ever be. Now get off our land." The storm broke by evening. The floodwaters receded as quickly as they had risen, leaving a thick layer of silt over everything. But the barn was dry, and the furniture, their salvation, was safe in the loft. They were cleaning the mud from the workshop floor when Joshua's broom hit a loose brick in the back wall. It crumbled inward, revealing a dark cavity. "What the?" Joshua knelt down. He pulled at the masonry. Behind the brick was a hollow space, and inside sat a gray metal lockbox. "It's Jacob's," Sophie said, wiping her muddy hands on her jeans. They gathered around the workbench. Joshua used a chisel to pop the lock. Inside was a stack of cash, maybe $2,000, and a thick, sealed envelope. Sophie picked up the envelope. It was addressed in shaky handwriting, "To my grandchildren." She opened it, her hands trembling. She began to read aloud, her voice echoing in the quiet barn. "Dear Sophie and Joshua, if you are reading this, I am gone. I have left you the farm, though I fear I have left you a burden more than a gift. I was not a good man. I was proud, and I was angry, and I drove my own son away because I couldn't face my own shame. You need to know the truth about the Mills, Arthur, and Eleanor." Sophie paused, looking at Arthur. He was pale, leaning heavily on his cane. 30 years ago, I was driving my truck home from the bar. I was drunk. I took a turn too wide and ran a car off the road. It went into a ditch. I didn't stop. I was a coward. I drove home and pretended it never happened." Arthur gasped, a sound like he had been punched. His hand went to his mouth. "The next day, I heard that a local carpenter and his wife had been found in the wreck. The man's leg was crushed. He never walked right again. He lost his ability to climb, to frame, to work the big jobs. He lost his business because of that injury. I watched from afar as he struggled for decades, never able to get ahead. When the cancer came later, they had nothing left to fight with because I had stolen their livelihood 30 years prior." The silence in the barn was absolute. The only sound was the dripping of water from the eaves. "When I found them living in their car 3 years ago, I knew who they were. I offered them the basement not out of kindness, but out of guilt. I couldn't look them in the eye and tell them I was the one who started their ruin. I kept them hidden because I was afraid of the law, yes, but mostly I was afraid of their judgment. I am sorry. I hope, somehow, this farm can make it right." Sophie lowered the letter. She couldn't look at Arthur. The weight of her grandfather's sin filled the room, suffocating them. Jacob hadn't just been a bystander, he had been the architect of Arthur's suffering. The accident had taken Arthur's resilience, leaving him vulnerable to everything that came after. Joshua stepped back, looking terrified. "Arthur, we didn't know. I swear to God, we didn't know." Arthur stood frozen. He looked at the letter in Sophie's hand. He looked at his leg, the one that pained him every time it rained. He looked at the years of poverty, the struggle, the fear, all of it traceable back to the man whose roof he had been living under. Anger flashed in his eyes. Hot, righteous anger. It would be so easy to hate them. To hate the name Evans. To walk away and burn the place down. Then, Arthur looked at Joshua. He saw the boy who had just jumped into a flood to save an enemy. He saw the boy who had learned to carve cherry wood with a gentle touch. He saw the boy who called him Arthur, with respect, not pity. He saw the family that had been built in this barn not by blood but by sweat and shared meals. Arthur walked over to Sophie. He took the letter from her hand. "Arthur?" Eleanor whispered, clutching his arm. Arthur walked to the wood stove in the corner of the shop where a small fire was crackling to dry out the damp air. He opened the iron door and tossed the letter inside. "Arthur!" Joshua cried out. That's proof. You could sue the estate. You could take everything. You deserve it." Arthur watched the paper curl and blacken, the confession turning to ash and floating up the chimney. He turned back to them. "Jacob Evans was a coward," Arthur said, his voice steady. "He is dead. He is the past." He walked over and put a hand on Joshua's shoulder, squeezing tight. "But the Evans family standing here, the ones who gave us a home, the ones who saved my life, you are good people. I will not let a dead man's sin destroy what we have built." Eleanor walked over and took Sophie's hand. "We are a family," she said firmly, "and families forgive." Sophie sobbed, the tension of the last month finally breaking. She hugged Eleanor, burying her face in the older woman's shoulder, smelling flour and rain. Joshua hugged Arthur, holding on to the grandfather he had finally found. 6 months later. The sun was setting over Evans Ridge, painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet. The breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and freshly sanded wood. A new sign swung from the post at the end of the driveway. It had been carved from a single piece of black walnut, sanded to a mirror finish, the letters filled with gold leaf. Evans and Mills Heritage Woodworks, established by family Sophie, sat on the porch swing, going over the accounts on a new laptop. They were in the black. The tax debt was paid. Colton, humbled and facing his own legal troubles for the environmental damage to the creek, had withdrawn his claims and moved to the city. In the driveway, a delivery truck was backing up. Joshua walked out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked taller, filled out, his eyes clear and bright. He directed the driver with a confidence that made Sophie smile. Arthur sat in a chair nearby, whittling a small bird from a scrap of cedar. He couldn't do the heavy lifting anymore, but he was the master designer, the heart of the operation. Joshua walked up the porch steps. Trucks loaded. "That's the Richmond order done." "Good," Sophie said. "We have 3 more inquiries this morning, 1 from New York." Joshua sat on the railing looking out over the valley. The fireflies were just starting to blink in the tall grass. "You know, I used to dream about California," he said. "The ocean, running away." "I know," Sophie said. "It seems kind of empty now," Joshua said. He looked at Arthur, who was holding the wooden bird up to the light, checking the curve of the wing. "I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Sophie closed the ledger. She looked at the house. No longer a gray, peeling beast, but a home. Painted, loved, alive. "Me too," she said, leaning her head back against the swing. "Me too." If this story touched your heart, subscribe to The Farmer's Promise and turn on notifications so you never miss another tale of resilience, hidden truths, and the families we build when life gives us a second chance. Share this with someone who needs to hear it.